Hello everyone, my name is Dube, the coolest online tutor. Welcome to the introduction to Law 101. Umtu ngumtu ngabantu, an African proverb which recognizes not just dignity but as well as the right to freedom and expression.
The underlying problem in any open and democratic society based on human dignity, equality and freedom, in which conscientious and religious freedom has to be regarded with appropriate seriousness, is how far such democracy can and must go in allowing members of cultural and religious communities to define for themselves which laws they will obey. At the same time, the state should, whenever possible, seek to avoid putting believers to extremely painful and intensely burdensome choices of either being true to their faith or else respectful of the law. For Human Rights 2022, it is behind this background that Dube's Jurisprudence seek to define and avoid the confusion on the limitation of rights in terms of Section 36 of the Constitution, 1996. The well-received of differentiation is particularly important in South Africa for countries' group membership based on supposed biological characteristics such as skin color has been the express basis of advantage and disadvantage. South Africa is a diverse country, rich in cultural and religion from all sizes and shapes. It is no doubt, if not the only country, to have more than 10 different cultures and at least 100 religions as an understating minimum, with 60.1 million of the last updated population on the 20th of March 2022. The developing of an active rather than a purely formal sense of enjoying a common citizenship depends on recognizing and accepting people with all their differences, as they are. Thus, the Constitution of South Africa acknowledges the vulnerability of human beings, culturally, religiously, or genetic, and affirms the right to be different, and celebrates the diversity of the nation. The protection of voluntary cultural or religious practice applies equally. Cultures, unlike religion, are not necessarily based on the tenets of faith but on a collection of practice, ideas or ways of being. While some cultures may be obligatory rules which act as condition for membership of the culture, many cultures, unlike many religions, will not have an authoritative body or text that determines the dictates of the culture. Any single member will not often observe all those practices that makes up the cultural existence but will choose those which he or she feels are most important to his or her own relationship to and expression of that culture. Thus, to limit cultural protection to cultural obligations would, for many cultures and their members, make the protection largely meaningless. It follows that whether a religious or cultural practice is voluntary, or mandatory is irrelevant at the threshold stage of determining whether it qualifies for protection. However, the centrality of the practice, which may be affected by its voluntary nature, is a relevant question in determining the fairness of discrimination. Section 36 of the Constitution allows for Parliament or private entities to limit rights afforded to South Africans. However, the limitation on the rights needs to pass the limitation analysis provided in terms of Section 36 of the Constitution. The purpose of this inquiry is to test the validity of the impugned provisions by determining whether Parliament could have achieved its goal without limiting the constitutional rights to the extent that it did. To pass constitutional muster, the limitation on the constitutional rights must be justifiable in terms of Section 36(1) of the Constitution. The limitation analysis requires an inquiry into whether the limitation is reasonable and justifiable in an open and democratic society based on human dignity, equality and freedom. The relevant considerations include the nature of the right and the scope of its limitation, the purpose, importance and the effect of the limitation, and the availability of less restrictive means to achieve that purpose. The limitation analysis thus involves the weighing up of competing values and ultimately an assessment based on proportionality. The weighing up and evaluation process must measure the three elements of the government interest, namely, the importance of the limitation, the relationship between the limitation and the underlying purpose of the limitation, and the impact that an exemption for religious or cultural reasons would have on the overall purpose of the limitation. Thus, whether the failure to accommodate the appellant's religious or cultural belief and practice by means of the exemption can be accepted as reasonable and justifiable in an open and democratic society based on the human dignity, freedom, and equality. What must be determined is whether the granting of the religious or cultural exemption would undermine the objectives of the prohibition. Firstly, the constitutional requirement that in limiting the constitutional rights regard must be had to less restrictive means that are available to achieve the purpose of the limitation. Second, the constitutional commitment to tolerance which calls for the accommodation of different religious or cultural faiths if this can be done without frustrating the objectives of the government. For example, it is a practice deeply rooted in African traditional worship where the burning of impefo is essential to communicating with ancestors. A constitutional right cannot be denied on the basis of mere speculation unsupported by conclusive and convincing evidence. Thus, a law may be rationally related to the end it is meant to pursue and yet fail to pass muster under the rights limitation analysis. However, rationality is a mere threshold requirement for the exercise of all public power. Thus, should the law limiting a specific right of a citizen's does not meet the above requirements, then such law will be declared unconstitutional and inappropriate relief for that person would be given into effect so as to protect his or her rights.
Thank you all for attending this tutorial. The coolest tutor now signing out. Cheers!